Okay, so welcome back to our final posting from the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show 2024, and I do hope you've enjoyed all of the previous 5 episodes that we've shown you, and in this episode here it's slightly longer than the previous one, so we can manage to fit all of the remaining bikes in that we filmed over the 2 days of the event. So let's get straight into our first mechanical subject, which is a 1981 250 reed valve Maico that belongs to Peter Williamson. So you may remember that we also had a look at Peter's other immaculate Alpha 1 Maico that was sitting on Bill Brown's Wolfsport stand in a previous episode, and this is Peter's other machine, this 250 Maico twinshocker, all decked out, of course, in this nice yellow livery, and unfortunately, once again, sporting a pair of those now popular black wheels, which I'll certainly have a word with Peter about why he's putting black wheels on an old twin shock scrambler, which, as I've mentioned before, for me is absolute blasphemy when it comes to these kind of classic bikes. But nevertheless, despite Peter's little misdemeanour and his lack of judgment with those black wheels, this is still quite a tidy looking bike that's got some quality parts bolted onto it, and even the yellow colour scheme's not even that bad either, but it still has the black Maico frame, as you can see, in the stock Maico rear swing arm as well, which is quite rare to still see on these older Maicos, because riders do tend to swap these for the much shinier, lighter alloy swing arms, which although they will be a bit brighter to look at and considerably lighter as well, the alloy swing arms are quite soft, and I don't think they can take the punishment on the track that the steel ones can, and many of the riders who have tried those alloy swing arms usually revert back to the much heavier and stronger steel items. But certainly this 250 reed valve Maico 2-stroke engine is one that I'm quite familiar with, because I did have an identical 250 engine in my 81 Maico when I raced it all those years ago. But it was a great little power plant. Okay, maybe not as powerful as its bigger brothers, the 400, 440, or maybe even the big 490s. But if you just wanted to have a bit of fun at the weekend, then this engine certainly made a fantastic club rider's motor. Now, here on the clutch and transmission side, these 81 reed valve 250s still had the old school primary chain to connect both the crank and the clutch together, and as you know, these primary chains could be a bit troublesome from time to time if they weren't checked periodically, and if they were neglected, they could, even in worst cases, just break altogether. But I have to say, in all the years that I owned my 2 Maicos, that particular scenario never really occurred. But Peter's 250 here certainly has some quite nice upgrades on it, with these billet alloy sprocket guards and rear brake lever, and of course that replacement CNC machined alloy ignition cover there as well. Now, the front forks on Peter's Maico are more or less your standard 81 Maico items, which even for that year, these were still quite decent suspension units. And Peter's also fitted a pair of these black fork gaiters just to try and help protect those precious stanchions from stones and other pieces of crap that get thrown up from the racetrack. And as we move on to the rear of our 250 Maico, it's a nice pair of Swedish-made Öhlins piggyback racing shocks, probably These will be as good a pair of rear suspension units that you'll ever get for one of these older twin shock bikes, and these once again are all fully rebuildable and tunable to suit the rider's own particular style and weight. But this yellow colour scheme is yet another kind of theme that you can have for your old twin shock Maico, and I must say that in the past I've certainly seen these old Maicos in black and even blue and even white and red, and it seems these days if you can just imagine a particular colour, then they can have your old Maico decked out in it. Although on the day of the show I'm not exactly sure if Peter's 81250 here was being offered up for sale or maybe just as a display item, but nevertheless this is still a very nice piece of kit regardless of those black wheels. And moving right along onto the Elderfield motorcycle stand, which they were calling their Bargain Corner Show Specials, and the guys at Elderfield always bring along one or two of their red rockets to Telford each year, and this first bike here was certainly a cracker, all done up in the Moto Fox graphics. I think it's a 1979 CR250, and this bike had actually been reduced from what was £11,000 to £7,950, so certainly it's a massive reduction in the original purchase price, and of course true to their sales pitch on the day of their Bargain Corner show specials. Now, Elderfield Motorcycles, as you know, is a small family run affair who have been in business for more than 30 years, specialising in all manner of off-road motorsports, and they more or less do absolutely everything with regards repairs, restorations or rebuilds for all manner of motorcycles. And of course they do specialise in the repair, maintenance and restoration and supplying parts for these Honda red rockets. So these are definitely the guys to speak to if your old red rocket is needing a facelift. But just prior to these Honda red rockets being introduced to Europe in the late 1970s, riders at that time were quite content with their European Bultacos, Husqvarnas and even Maicos, but when Honda delivered these red rockets to dealerships around the UK, then most racers just couldn't wait to trade in or even sell their trusty European steeds so that they could then own the latest off-road rocket ship that came from Japan, and even straight from the crate with absolutely no adjustments or upgrades whatsoever. These red rockets did start winning races almost immediately, and the rest, as they say, is just motocross racing history. And not only were these bikes flying on the track, they were also flying out the dealership doors faster than Honda could even make the bikes. But no question, these 79 CR250 rockets certainly had it all, because even just standing still, these bikes looked fantastic, and they of course had that super strong steel tubular chassis that was both reasonably light and flickable. But the star of these 79 Red Devils was that it had that super quick 250 two-stroke engine that was lightningly fast, and it was painted in this kind of Honda fire engine red. So it was pretty fair to say that the motocross world had never seen anything like them before. And in fact, even today, these red rockets are still very much sought after for classic or twin shock racing, and it's almost impossible now to still find an original unmolested bike with all of its 70s parts still intact. And that's where the likes of the Elderfield guys come in, who can either source new old stock parts or even have the originals remanufactured, just to enable you to keep your beloved Red Rocket Rooster on the racetrack. And certainly these few examples that the Elderfield guys have put together are absolutely stunning. Okay, so they're maybe not all of them got their original bits and pieces still bolted onto them, but what do you expect on a 45-year-old dirt bike these days? It's only natural that things like exhausts and suspension parts and other consumables are going to wear out and have to be replaced with even a pattern or remanufactured part, which doesn't really bother me in the slightest, because I think it's much more important that we keep these old bikes on the track where we can still see them perform for the reason that they were built for in the first place, as an off-road racing motorcycle. So there you see it, a very nice collection there of what is still an iconic bike from the late 1970s, and it's all thanks again to Elderfield motorcycles. Now, as rare bikes go, this was yet another little gem that I managed to unearth at this year's Telford show, and this 1999 American-made ATK 257 was sitting on the D&G Vintage restoration stand, and it's thanks to young Aaron for helping me dig the bike out so that we could have a decent look at it, because after all, my last encounter with blocking the walkways of Telford, I had to certainly work fast on this bike this time round, just in case my ass got kicked again by security. But once again, because this is such a rare and quite interesting bike, we're just going to take a little sneaky preview of the bike in this clip. But once we're completely finished with all of the Telford uploads, we're then going to make this bike the very first full feature on my channel immediately after. But I'm sure that you're already aware that ATK Motorcycles was the brainchild of Austrian-born motorcycle engineer Horst Leitner, who moved his entire family to America so that he could further develop his motorcycle engineering skills. And it was actually Leitner who put together his anti-chain tension system for off-road bikes that really put him on the motorcycle engineering map, and it eventually led to him setting up his own bike building company, which he naturally titled ATK in relation to his anti-chain tensioning system, which, to give it its initial title, was originally called the Anti-Tension Kettingen Tribe, or simply ATK for short. And throughout the 1980s and early 90s, Leitner certainly designed some fantastic ATK machines, with most of them using Rotax two-strokes, or even the big Rotax four-strokers, which in the USA were certainly the most popular, using the big 560s or even the bigger 605 thumper motors, which at that time weren't exactly cheap to buy. And if you were lucky enough to own a big ATK in the States at that time, then you were certainly a very special person indeed. And so our particular 1999 ATK has one of the later Rotax two-stroke motors, and this is a 257cc power plant with a counterbalanced power valve and a 6-speed wide ratio gearbox. And by all accounts, this was a very compact and powerful little beast for just 257, and because it was a liquid-cooled two-stroke built by Rotax, it was, as you know, unbreakable, and it's so much so that these motors were also used to power kart racers as well. But we'll dive more into the engine at a later date. But up here at the front end of our ATK, it was a pair of Paoli conventional 46mm forks. So these were quite a sturdy pair of front legs for such a light two-stroke bike such as this. And here at the back end of the bike, it's a single Öhlins monoshock, mounted, of course, to this left-hand side of the swing arm, which was yet another Horst Leitner innovation, because Horst's thinking was that if you mounted one single shock onto this outside of the swing arm, it was so much easier to swap it out in a race situation, as opposed to all of the hassle of disconnecting linkages and other parts if the shock was mounted in the centre in the conventional fashion. And looking at the bike from this rear view, you can see it kind of looks like there's maybe even a shock missing from that other side, but it was certainly an innovative idea from Horst Leitner. Now, as I said, young Aaron at D&G Vintage Restorations had this little ATK beauty up for sale on the day, and obviously somebody seemed to know exactly what it was, and they knew about its rarity, so they simply snapped it up. So it's quite lucky that we got these few pictures and clips when we did, but as I said, I don't want to go into too much detail about the bike this time round, because this will be the first full feature on CDB TV after we've completed these Telford clips. So make sure that you look out for that coming soon. But certainly a rare and very interesting bike, this 1999 ATK 257. Right, so this was yet another nice classic that was sitting on the D&G Vintage Restorations display, this quite nice 400 CZ, which was also being offered up for sale, and as far as I know has now been sold to a lucky buyer. But again, another good quality Czechoslovakian racer, and a bike that looks like it could be one of those Falter machines from way back in the day, with that instantly recognisable coffin-shaped alloy fuel tank, and of course that upswept exhaust expansion chamber. Now, I can't actually remember if Aaron told me that this was maybe a 380 or a 400, because there was so much going on over the course of the 2 days. My head was absolutely buzzing with bike stuff, but you can see that the carb on this engine has been changed from the original Jakob unit for this much better and more reliable Mikuni, which, as you're aware, those old Jakob carbs didn't exactly have a good reputation for their quality. But again, you can see a nice porcupine cylinder head, which I'm not actually sure if this was a stock standard fitting on this engine back in the day, but a few of the barrel's fins have also been removed, which I do know have all been done at CZ HQ and not done in some aftermarket machine shop many years later. But our CZ motor certainly appears to have all of its original bits and pieces, apart, of course, from that carburetor. So this alloy fuel tank is again correct for our Czechoslovakian racer, and this bike is more than likely from the mid-1970s, but there was absolutely no need for bolts and nuts and washers to hold this fuel tank onto the frame. You just simply whipped the belt out of your trousers and then snapped it on to the tank. But all joking aside, could you think of a better, cheaper, quicker, or even cost-effective way to fit a tank onto a motorcycle? Because this was just a simple case of undoing the leather belt buckle, and then the tank was simply removed. But even for the early or even mid 1970s, the front forks on these CZs were pretty good considering the motorcycle suspension technologies of its time, and these old Czechoslovakian racers also had quite good hubs and brakes for an old school drum and shoe arrangement. But even in this modern day, I can still see these CZ hubs and brakes being used on project and other special build hybrid bikes, so these must have been pretty good for bike builders to even consider using them in this modern day. But here at the back end of our 400 Falter, these are of course not the original shocks, and in fact I don't have a clue as to what make or model these are, but the original suspension units that the CZ guys put on these bikes in the 1970s weren't really up to much anyhow, and normally as soon as owners bought the bikes brand new, then the shocks were usually the first things to get changed. Although this is yet again another fine motorcycle from young Aaron Gledhill and his very talented associates at D&G Vintage Racing and Restoration, so obviously somebody has appreciated their quality over the weekend, because they sold both that lovely ATK and this Falter CZ, and that was just a couple of the many bikes that they brought along to this year's show at Telford. So it just goes to show you that some bikes can be a bit pricey for most owners' pockets, but if you present a decent bike for fair money, then you've certainly a better chance of securing a sale. Now, you may remember in my last episode that we did have one more trials bike to take a look at, and I think that we've certainly saved the best until last with this superb looking little BSA Bantam trials bike that was called a Wrap Bantom. And again, it was the thing that caught my eye was this little bike's immaculate engineering and the quality of all of the modifications that have been made to the machine, although the information about the bike that I was actually given on the day was apparently lost in transit, so to speak, but I'll certainly try and at least let you have a closer look at this bike's workings. So this here is the little Wrap Bantam frame prior to painting or plating, and of course this frame here is built by DRR Engineering, and it looks like these chassis are all bronze welded, and the quality of the welds and the general overall construction of these Bantam frames and the many parts that are bolted onto them are about as good a quality as you're ever going to find. And I must say, it's quite nice to see all of this engineering on the framework and the bronze welding just before it actually gets covered in any paint or maybe even nickel or chrome plating, which it does tend to hide a lot of the workmanship during construction. But here in this shot you can see that BSA Bantam motor sitting inside the frame just prior to all of its other bits and pieces being bolted into place. But more very nice bronze welding there again with a nice alloy bash plate just underneath the engine, which is a very important part of any kind of trials bike, as you know. But by now you've probably worked out that this BSA Bantam motor isn't your stock standard 125, 150 or even 175 power plant. This bike is absolutely bristling with brand new updated billet alloy parts, and the company that manufactures and builds all of these new parts certainly had samples on display for any interested parties to take a look at. All secured, of course, in place, just in case some of the sticky finger brigade decided they would help themselves. And when you put all of these parts together along with the completed engine and the bike chassis, this is exactly what you get. A superb, lightweight, fully British-built BSA Wrap Bantam, a stunning piece of motorcycle engineering that I'm pretty sure any trials rider or even a trials bike collector would just love to own or to have one in their collection. But certainly my apologies for not being able to name drop the person or the persons who engineer all of the parts on this bike, but certainly DRR and AW Race Engineering have certainly something to do with this bike's construction, and there is a contact number there on that airbox, so it might be worth a quick call if you need any more information. But I'm quietly confident that AW Race Engineering are certainly the guys to talk to about this bike. And when you take a look at this BSA Bantam motor, you can see it's no ordinary BSA Bantam engine, because it has different engine casings and different ignition covers and a few other upgrades from what was the original DKW designed engine from the 1960s. But again, the improvements that have been done on this motor are just absolutely first class. And so the little Bantam's fuel tank is once again all handmade in aluminium and then sculpted to enable it to fit neatly onto this brand new chassis. And also at the front end of the bike, more custom made parts with these nicely made triple clamps that of course held the front forks of the bike, which I'm sure have also been specifically manufactured to use on this Wrap Bantam trials, because they do look far too good to be one of the more common Serianis, Marzocchis or other makes of suspension units that you normally come across on these old British trials bikes. But here at the back, I wouldn't be too surprised if these shocks also haven't been specifically manufactured to bolt onto our brand new Bantam chassis. Although over the course of the 2 days I certainly did come across some very nice old bikes that had some good parts and other upgrades bolted onto them, but for me, in terms of the nicest trials bike at the show, then this was the bike for me that stood out with regards to its quality parts and engineering. And maybe it's because my own particular D1 BSA Bantam was the first ever bike that I owned, then maybe that's what drew me into looking at this bike in the first place. And if money wasn't a factor, and although I'm not really a trials bike fan, I would certainly like to buy or maybe even own one of these, not to ride, but just to sit and look at all the wonderful engineering that's gone into building this fantastic looking machine. So next up, as the rare motorcycles continue at Telford, this was yet another super rare KTM 125 LC, a model that they told me only had a production run of just 6 months, and in that time they say that very few of these liquid-cooled 125 bikes were actually made. Now, the information that was posted on the bike the day that I grabbed these clips was that the bike was run by Farioli Corsa from Bergamo in Italy, and the rider at that time was Giuseppe Andriani, who they say won both races on this bike when it was raced at the NSC Niederwuschbach, which at that time was said to be the home of the 1981 German motocross Grand Prix. Now, I'm not exactly sure as to the actual year of this bike, but it's almost certainly a mid-1980s machine or thereabouts, but the actual year of manufacture wasn't posted with the information on the day. But certainly our little KTM here was just one of a few immaculate classics that were on display on the Solo motorcycle stand, who tend to buy, sell, restore and even display all manner of vintage road and dirt bikes, and it's certainly worthwhile a visit to their web page just to try and check out the hundreds of bikes that they have in their stocks. But our KTM featured here, as you can see, has a light steel tubular kind of chassis, which is really much the same frame, I think, that was used on the earlier air-cooled KTMs, with maybe a slight redesigning of the engine mounting position so as to take this new water-cooled motor. But you can probably make out that the bottom part of the KTM engine is pretty much the same crankcases and internals that were used on the old air-cooled engines, and obviously this top end here has the replacement liquid-cooled barrel and head with a slightly re-engineered left-hand side clutch casing just to enable it to take a water pump so as to pump the cooling fluid around that barrel and head. Now, the engine's still a simple piston porter without, of course, the need for a reed valve, but of course this fuel is being fed into the motor by a big Bing 84 type carburetor. So the word is that when these little KTMs first hit the racetracks, the Austrians mounted the cooling system radiator behind this grille here at the front of the bike. But when the bikes were actually raced at some of those wet and muddy European racetracks, then these cooling intakes were the first things to get blocked up, and that of course led to the motors overheating, and seizures were very common on these 125s earlier in their production. So of course the bike designers at KTM had to find a better location for the radiator, and where do you think they actually put it? That's right, fixed underneath the bike's fuel tank here, lying horizontally across the top of the engine. And I can't imagine what kind of difference that would have made with all of the heat being generated by the engine, but maybe that's why not too many of these bikes were actually made. And I can't really imagine that this would have been an improvement over the more practical original location, but despite that strange upgrade on this bike, this was still a nice original looking machine, and as far as I'm aware this was another classic that was being offered up for sale on the day, although as with many of the other machines, I'm not exactly sure if this one here again was actually sold. But as I said, a visit to Solo Motorcycles website might certainly provide the answer. But as I said, this was just one of about half a dozen lovely original looking motorcycles that were on the Solo Motorcycles display stand. Some very nice looking bikes, and this was certainly one of the more outstanding and rare machines. A lovely 1980s KTM 125 LC. Right, so just to conclude our coverage from this year's 2024 Telford show, we're going to finish this final episode by checking out this nice 1979 Maico MC400, and this is yet another bike that's been restored by Steve Coughlin. You may remember Steve, he was the guy that had that nice 1988 RM250 Suzuki that we showed you in a previous episode. But Steve certainly knows how to put a bike together, and these old classics, and this 79 400 has had the full treatment with regards the frame and engine and all of the other parts that are bolted onto this bike. And this is probably for me one of the best examples of one of these 79 Maicos that I've seen in quite some time. Although even back in 1979 these 400s were still very quick race bikes because of that brilliant light tubular steel chassis, and of course this 400 two-stroke motor, which as you can see has had the reed valve conversion done on the barrel. But back in 1979 these Maico motors would have just been a simple piston porter. Now, although the reed valve conversion does help to try and eliminate the bogging down that you used to get going into the slow corners with these engines, which was a quite common niggle on the piston port power plants, but I can certainly relate to this 400 Maico engine because I did have the slightly bigger 440 motor in my old 1980 bike, which of course didn't have as good a chassis as these 79ers, but the motor was certainly a peach of an engine. Not as scary, of course, as the mighty 490, of course, but the 440 did make a good club racer's engine. But they do say that if you can't get your hands on a 490 Maico chassis and engine, then these 79 frame and 400 engine combinations are still a very good alternative, because they both had quite similar handling characteristics and engine power, and other parts like the front and the rear suspension systems were also similar in the way that they perform. But Steve's not fully put this old Maico twinshocker back to its 79 factory original condition, because this bike here is still going to be raced, as I believe. So the old Corte Cosso shocks have been swapped for these top of the range Swedish made Öhlins piggybacks, which of course are far superior. But you can certainly see that this bike's been well prepped and built by Steve, although some jobs like this superbly painted fuel tank, as far as I know, were outsourced to professionals. And as I remember, I think it was CNG Auto Body Repairs who worked their magic prepping and painting this lovely alloy fuel tank. And actually, prior to the bike appearing here at this year's Telford show, it was also involved in a professional photo shoot soon after it was completed. And you can certainly see some really snazzy pictures of this 479 bike, with, of course, some lovely ladies in tow. If you just take a look at Steve's website at stevecoughlin.racing.co.uk, and you should also be able to pick up a few more bits of information on the bike as well. But certainly, once again, this is another top restoration from the Steve Coughlin workshop, and this is yet another bike that we may just take a much more in-depth look at here on CDB TV at a later date. So there you have it. That just about wraps up all of our coverage from this year's Classic Dirt Bike Show, and I do hope that you've enjoyed all 6 episodes that we've posted. But of course, this is only a few of the machines that were actually at Telford this year, and although we did our very best to try and bring you as many as we possibly could, we often can't get access to some of the more precious motorcycle items. But thanks again for tuning in and for your comments on the Telford Show videos. But as usual, if these are the kind of bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, then why not consider subscribing to my channel. So from Classic Dirt Bike TV and the 2024 Telford Show, it's goodbye for now.